Welcome to another episode of Who's There? Horror Stories and Reports, where shadows come alive and the whispers in the walls have much to tell. In today's episode, we'll explore accounts that have reached us through those who dared to face the unknown. Stories of inexplicable encounters, presences that defy logic, and moments when the line between our world and something beyond simply vanished. And as we always say here on the channel, sometimes it's better not to answer when someone or something asks, "Who's there?" My name is Miguel Suarez. I'm 35 years old, and I've been a truck driver for almost 15 springs. I inherited this profession from my father, who also spent weeks on the road before retiring. I have a small ranch on the outskirts of General Terran, in Nuevo León, where I raise some cattle and grow a little corn when I'm not traveling. I've always liked this life divided between the road and the countryside, despite the loneliness that sometimes hits hard, especially after my wife Teresa decided she couldn't stand waiting for a husband who was always absent. She left 2 years ago, taking our dog but leaving behind memories that still haunt every corner of the house. I know every curve and pothole of the region's roads like the palm of my hand, especially that little dirt road that crosses the Valley of Shadows, a name that always seemed exaggerated to me, but which after that August night last year began to make complete sense. The road is the shortest path between the town of San Mateo, where I usually deliver goods, and my ranch, saving almost an hour of travel compared to the paved road that goes around the mountains. It was a Tuesday, August 17th, and I was returning from San Mateo after delivering a load of fertilizers to the local cooperative. I'd left later than planned because the cooperative staff took a long time to unload my truck, and when I finally hit the road back, it was already past midnight. The sky was clear, with a waning moon barely illuminating the path, and that, cutting cold, typical of early mornings in the region, even in summer. The dirt road wound between hills covered with dense vegetation, creating shadows that seemed to move with the passing of my truck. The radio reception was poor in that stretch, so I drove in silence with only the roar of the engine and the occasional howl of some distant animal breaking the stillness of the night. My eyes were already burning with fatigue when the dashboard clock marked 2:13 in the morning. It was exactly at that moment that my truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the road, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. It was a tall man, wearing a dark poncho that reached almost to his feet, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He didn't make any hand signal, didn't move, just stood there as if he knew I was going to stop, and the strangest thing is that I really did stop. To this day I can't explain why. Normally I would never stop for a stranger in the middle of the night, on a deserted road like that. My father always taught me to be wary. He used to say, "The road has more dangers than curves, my son." But something about that man made me step on the brake almost automatically, as if my hands and feet had a will of their own. The truck skidded, a little on the loose dirt before coming to a complete stop, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the beams of the headlights. I rolled down the window and shouted, "Want a ride, friend?" There was no response. The man began walking toward the truck with slow, precise steps, in no hurry at all, as if he had all the time in the world. I noticed he didn't limp or show any sign of fatigue, despite being at least 15 kilometers from the nearest town. When he approached, he didn't come to my window as I expected. Instead, without saying a word, he headed to the back of the truck and climbed into the cargo bed. I could hear his steps on the metal sheet, but I never heard his voice, not once. This was already getting too strange. I thought about starting up and continuing my journey, but something told me I should check if everything was all right. I got out of the truck, feeling the early morning cold cut my skin like a razor. It must have been about 5 degrees C, maybe less. My breath formed clouds of vapor in front of my face as I walked toward the back. The man was sitting in a corner of the empty cargo bed, perfectly still, with his back against the side of the truck. "Everything okay over there, friend? Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound friendly, but already with a chill in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. He slowly raised his face, and that's when I noticed it. Despite the cutting cold, no vapor came from his mouth or nose when he breathed. In fact, I couldn't even tell if he was breathing. The moonlight partially illuminated his face from beneath the hat, revealing angular features, skin as pale as paper, and eyes. My God, those eyes. They were dark, deep, and fixed on a point beyond me, as if seeing something in the distance that only he could see. They didn't blink. I've never seen eyes so empty and at the same time so full of, I can't explain it, some kind of ancient sadness. It's okay, I stammered. I'll take you as far as I can. He didn't respond, just continued with that fixed stare. I returned to the cabin with trembling legs, trying to convince myself that he was just a strange guy, maybe mute or a bit disturbed in the head. I started the engine and continued my journey, trying to calm myself. The radio was still failing, picking up only static and incomprehensible fragments of some distant music. From time to time, I looked in the rearview mirror, but could only see a piece of the man's black poncho. The road became increasingly narrow and winding as we advanced through the valley. The sensation inside the cabin was suffocating, a cold that seemed to come from inside out, even with the heater turned up to maximum. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel despite the low temperature, and I couldn't stop thinking about those fixed eyes, that absence of breathing. At each curve, I felt the truck was heavier, as if it was carrying much more than just a thin man. The silence was so dense that I could hear my own heart beating rapidly. I tried to start a conversation several times, speaking loudly so he could hear me from the cargo bed. This road gets dangerous with fog, doesn't it? Or, do you work at some ranch around here? No response. Just that heavy silence and the growing sensation that there was something deeply wrong with my passenger. The kilometers dragged on, and no matter how much I accelerated, it seemed we weren't getting anywhere. The hills around looked the same, as if we were going in circles, although I knew that road too well to get lost. After what seemed like an eternity, I reached the gate of the Mendonça Ranch, which is about halfway between San Mateo and my ranch. I always need to stop there to open the gate, drive the truck through and close it again. An agreement I have with Mr. Mendonça to be able to take a shortcut through his lands. I stopped the truck, left the engine running, and got out, feeling my legs numb and heavy. The gate was about 10 meters from where I parked. As I walked toward it, I had the strange sensation that someone was watching me intensely. I turned to look at the truck, and I swear by all that's sacred, the man was standing in the cargo bed completely motionless, watching me. The full moon partially illuminated his face, and I could see that his lips were moving, as if he was saying something, but no sound reached me. I looked away for just a second to open the padlock on the gate, and when I looked back, he had disappeared. There was no sign of him in the cargo bed, in the vicinity of the truck, or anywhere visible on that deserted road. I ran back to the truck, my heart almost jumping out of my mouth, and checked every corner of the cargo bed with my cell phone flashlight. There was nothing there except some dark stains on the metal, which under the light looked terribly like dried blood, but which I had never noticed before. I got into the cabin with trembling hands, locked the doors, and floored the accelerator as soon as I passed through the gate, not even bothering to close it properly. I wanted distance from that place, and fast. The rest of the trip was a blur of fear and anxiety. At every curve, I expected to see that poncho-clad figure standing in the middle of the road. My eyes burned from checking the mirrors so much. I turned on all the auxiliary lights, even the fog lights I rarely use, in a desperate attempt to keep away the shadows that seemed to close in around the truck. When I finally arrived home, it was already past 4 in the morning. I parked haphazardly in the yard, ran inside, and locked all the doors and windows. I turned on all the lights in the house and sat in the kitchen with a bottle of cane liquor and a sugarcane machete that belonged to my grandfather. I didn't get a wink of sleep for the rest of the night. At every noise, a branch hitting the window, the wind whistling in the tiles, the natural creaking of wood, I jumped from the chair. When the sun finally rose, I went out to examine the truck in the daylight. The dark stains I had seen in the cargo bed had completely disappeared. There was no trace that anyone had been there. For a moment, I began to doubt my own sanity, thinking that perhaps it was all just a hallucination caused by fatigue. But it was too real. The supernatural cold, those empty eyes, the sudden disappearance. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. Who would believe me? But curiosity was stronger than fear, and I began to ask discreetly if anyone had ever seen anything strange on that road. Most people avoided the subject or laughed, thinking I was joking. It was only on Friday, when I went to the town market to buy provisions, that I got some answers. Don Antinor, a man of about 80, who spent his days sitting in a rocking chair on the market porch, called me over with a gesture when he saw me unloading purchases into the truck. "I heard you asking about the Valley Road," he said in a hoarse voice, chewing his twist tobacco. "You saw him, didn't you? The man in the poncho." I felt a chill run up my spine. How did he know? I confirmed with a nod, unable to speak, and the old man continued. "You're not the first, nor will you be the last. My compadre Juvenal saw him about 10 years ago. Jose de las Coles' son too, about 3 years ago. Always in the same stretch, always after midnight." The old man spat on the ground before continuing. "It was Ignacio Bueno, owner of the Cruzeiro ranch that used to be right in that valley. In 1976, he was ambushed by cattle thieves when returning from the city. They shot him 3 times and threw his body into a ravine. They found him only days later, already almost unrecognizable. His cloudy eyes fixed on mine. They say he's still looking for his murderers, that he hasn't rested because justice was never done. The 3 men who did it were never caught. I left the market with weak legs and a boiling head. Don Antinor told me more details about the case while I remained there, unable to leave, thirsty for answers. The old man said that Ignacio Bueno was known for being a fair man who paid his employees well and helped those in need in the region. The night of the crime, he was returning from San Mateo after selling some cattle and had the money with him. The killers were laborers from a neighboring ranch who knew his routine. The body was found still wearing the poncho and hat, but without the money. "The strangest thing," said Don Antinor, lowering his voice, "is that months after the death, bodies began to appear in the region. 3 men, killed in the same way as Ignacio. 3 shots and thrown into ravines. They never discovered who did it, but everyone knew they were the suspects in Bueno's murder." I returned home unable to get that story out of my head. In the following nights, I couldn't sleep well, always waking up startled, with the feeling that there was someone standing in the darkness of my room, watching me with those empty eyes. I began to research the story in the archives of the small, local newspaper and discovered that there really were those mysterious murders. The dates matched, the names too. 2 weeks later, I made a decision that many would call madness. I needed to understand what was happening, and the only way would be to return to that road at the same time. On Monday night, exactly at 2 a.m., I was driving my truck along the same stretch where I had encountered the man in the poncho. The moon was the same as the night of the encounter, the cold too. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would explode in my chest. Reduced speed and began to carefully observe the shadows at the edge of the road. Nothing. After an hour of going back and forth along the same stretch, I stopped the truck exactly where I had first seen the figure. I turned off the engine, took a deep breath and got out. The silence of the night was absolute, not even the chirping of a cricket or the whisper of leaves in the trees. It was as if the entire world had stopped breathing. "Ignacio Bueno," I called, my voice echoing among the hills. "I know who you are. I know what happened to you." Nothing happened, just the heavy silence of the night. Then I decided to do something I never imagined I would have the courage to do. I walked to the edge of the ravine where, according to the stories, his body had been found. The moonlight illuminated the place with enough clarity to see the bottom of the precipice, about 15 meters below. That's when I noticed something shining among the rocks and vegetation. With my heart in my mouth, I observed that gleam coming from the bottom of the ravine for a few minutes. I thought about going down to see what it was, but the idea of climbing that steep slope in the middle of the night seemed unwise. Instead, I mentally marked the spot, determined to return during the day. That's when I felt an icy wind pass through me, despite the night being completely still. A strange sensation enveloped me. It wasn't fear, but a kind of silent understanding. I returned to the truck, and on the way, I had the distinct impression that someone was walking beside me, although there was no one visible. Inside the cabin, I noticed that the passenger seat was wet, as if someone with damp clothes had sat there. And on the dashboard, something that definitely wasn't there before. An old belt buckle, rusted and covered with dirt. The next morning, I didn't mention to anyone what had happened. I kept the rusted buckle in a drawer and followed my normal routine. From time to time, I researched something about Ignacio Bueno's story in the old newspapers at the municipal library, but found only fragments of information, nothing conclusive. John Untenor told me that Ignacio's daughter still lives somewhere in the region, but I never found the courage to look for her. What would I tell her? That I had seen the ghost of her father, that he had disappeared from the cargo bed of my truck. Over time, the intensity of the experience diminished, though it has never been forgotten. I changed my route and began to avoid the valley road at night, preferring the longer way on the paved road. Occasionally, when I pass by the town market, I see Don Antenor on the porch, and he always greets me with a look that seems to say he understands my silence. Other truck drivers sometimes mention strange things they've seen on that road, and I just listen, without sharing my own story. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that night or what Ignacio Bueno wanted from me. Perhaps some mysteries of the valley should remain just that, mysteries. My name is Lisa Oliveira. I'm 40 years old, and I've been a teacher for almost 2 decades. In early 2019, my life took a turn when I received news of my transfer to a small rural school in General Terran, an almost forgotten town on the map of Nuevo León, with fewer than 1,000 inhabitants. My marriage had just crumbled after 15 years, and that transfer, which should have been a punishment. Everyone in the education department knew nobody wanted to go to that middle of nowhere, ended up seeming like an opportunity to start over. Perfectly remember the day I drove down the dirt road that wound through corn plantations until reaching that building of bricks, discolored by time. The school had been reopened after being abandoned for almost 8 years, and despite the new paint and basic repairs, it still had that ancient feel, with creaking wood, windows that didn't close properly, and a peculiar damp smell that no disinfectant seemed to eliminate. Principal Augusto, a thin man with grey hair always combed back, greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes while showing me the facilities. "Feel at home, Professor Lisa. The children are eager to meet you. Just be careful with the central courtyard during the rains. The drainage still isn't right." My class was small, just 17 children between 8 and 10 years old, all children of rural workers from the region. In the first few days, I noticed something strange in their behavior during recess. While in other schools children ran all over the playground, here there was a circular area in the center that everyone religiously avoided, as if there were an invisible barrier. When I asked little Mateo about this, a freckled boy with attentive eyes who always sat in the front row, he looked from side to side before responding in an almost inaudible whisper. "It's because of the girl in the well, teacher. We don't play there." I felt an involuntary chill run up my back, but I smiled and tried to appear unconcerned, thinking it was just one of those children's legends that arise in old schools. In the teacher's lounge, when I mentioned the matter during break, there was an uncomfortable silence. Doña Marta, the science teacher who had worked in the region for more than 30 years, quickly changed the subject, talking about the harvest festival that would take place next month. That same afternoon, while organizing materials in my classroom cabinet, I had the feeling of being watched. I turned quickly, but the classroom was empty. That's when I noticed that the chalk pieces I had left aligned in the blackboard tray were now arranged in a small circle, something no student could have done, since I hadn't left the classroom since the end of class. I decided to investigate more about this girl in the well. Don Joaquin, the school janitor, had worked there since long before the temporary closure. He was a man of about 70, skin wrinkled by the sun, calloused hands, and eyes that seemed to hold more stories than he was willing to tell. I found him one Thursday at dusk, sweeping dry leaves in the hallway leading to the library. When I mentioned, "The matter?" he stopped sweeping and remained motionless for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to speak or not. "You shouldn't mess with these things, teacher," he finally said, leaning on the broom handle. I insisted, and he sighed deeply before starting to speak, lowering his voice as if the walls could hear. "About 30 years ago, there was a well right in the middle of what is now the courtyard. The girl's name was Carolina. She was 9 years old, They say she was playing alone after class while waiting for her mother who worked in the school kitchen. The well cover was rotten and she fell. When they found her, it was already too late. He made the sign of the cross and continued. After that, the stories began. Children who claimed to have seen her wandering the hallways, books that changed places, crying in the middle of the night. The school didn't close just for lack of funds, as they say around here. Many parents no longer wanted to send their children here. The following week, I began staying at school after hours to grade exams and prepare materials. The secretary always left me the key to lock everything when I left. One rainy Tuesday, around 6 in the evening, the sky was already dark and the hallways empty when I heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying. It wasn't hysterical crying, but that low, broken sobbing that comes after crying for a long time. My heart raced. I left the exams on the table and went out to check, calling, "Is anyone there? Any child still at school?" The crying seemed to come from the end of the hallway, near the old concrete drinking fountain. When I approached, the sound abruptly ceased. There was no one there, and all the classrooms were closed. I returned to my classroom, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night cold. The wooden windows banged with the wind, and I noticed that my coffee mug, which was on the table when I left, was now carefully placed on the high cabinet, in a place I would never reach without a chair. What disturbed me most was noticing a small wet impression next to the mug, as if someone with wet fingers had touched there. A small hand, the size of a child about 9 years old. I began to notice other strange occurrences in the following days. One morning, upon entering the classroom, I found all the students' work organized in a perfect pile when I was absolutely sure I had left them scattered on the table the night before. The chalk pieces kept disappearing from the drawers and reappearing in unlikely places, like inside my pencil case or balanced on top of the blackboard. The children also perceived things. Julia, a girl with braids who rarely spoke, raised her hand during math class and asked with disconcerting seriousness, "Teacher, who is the girl who keeps looking through the window during your classes?" When I turned to look, there was no one there, just the reflection of trees swaying in the wind. That night I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking about Carolina, the girl in the well, imagining her last moments. Would she have screamed for help as she fell into the darkness? How long was she there alone at the bottom of the well before they found her? These questions tormented me, and I began to dream of a small girl in a faded blue dress and dark hair, always with her back turned, always calling me to follow her to a place I couldn't clearly see in the dreams. One Friday, I arrived exceptionally early at school. The sun had barely risen, and I needed to organize a special presentation for parents that would take place in the afternoon. The main door was still closed, but Don Joaquin had already opened the back door to begin cleaning. I walked through the silent hallways, feeling that unsettling sensation of not being alone that had already become familiar. When I opened the door to my classroom, I froze in the entrance. All copies of the history book, exactly 20, were open on the desks, on the same page. These weren't books we had used recently. In fact, they were old books from the library collection that I hadn't even taken off the shelves. I approached with my heart racing. The page showed a black and white photograph of the school, dated 1989. In the center of what is now the courtyard, a stone well with a wooden structure around it was clearly visible. There were children posing. For the photo, smiles frozen in time, and teachers with clothes typical of the era. That's when I noticed something that froze my blood. In the window of what appeared to be the old library, there was a partially visible face. A girl who was looking directly at the camera, but wasn't aligned with the other students. Her gaze seemed to cross decades to find mine. I took a magnifying glass that we used in science classes and examined the detail. The girl had a dress that looked blue even in the black and white photo, and her eyes. Her eyes had an expression of such deep sadness that I felt a lump in my throat. That discovery left me so shocked that I cancelled the first class and went straight to the secretary's office. I needed to know more about Carolina. The secretary, Doña Nelida, a plump lady with thick glasses and nails always painted red, found my request to see the school's old files strange. "Those documents are a mess since the reopening, teacher, but I think the oldest ones are in that metal cabinet in the storage room. The storage room was a dusty cubicle in the back of the school, full of broken desks and obsolete teaching materials. In the corner, I found the rusted cabinet, closed with an old padlock. When I commented about the padlock with Doña Nélida, she frowned. How strange, it shouldn't be locked. She went to get a bunch of keys, but none worked. When we were about to give up, the padlock simply opened by itself, as if someone had opened it from inside. I exchanged a frightened look with the secretary, who muttered something about old locks and hurried out, leaving me alone. Inside the cabinet, I found dozens of folders yellowed by time. My fingers trembled as I searched for records from 1989. Finally, I found a school record card with a photo of Carolina Mendez, 9 years old. It was her, the same girl from the window, with large, sad eyes, dark, shoulder-length hair, and a small birthmark near her upper lip. On the back of the card, a handwritten note simply said, "Deceased on 05/12/1989, accident on school grounds." In the following week, the manifestations intensified. Students began to report seeing a girl in the hallways, always out of the corner of their eye, always disappearing around a corner. The temperature in my classroom dropped dramatically at certain times of the day, making the children shiver, even when the strong spring sun was beating down outside. One Tuesday, during dictation, all the pens in the classroom stopped working, simultaneously. 17 different pens, some new, simply dried up at the same moment. When the students went out to recess, I stayed alone organizing materials and distinctly heard a child's voice very close to my ear. "Will you help me, teacher?" I turned abruptly, dropping books to the floor. There was no one visible, but I swear I could feel, a cold little hand touching my arm. I was paralyzed, unable to scream or run. That's when I noticed that the fallen books had formed a circular pattern on the floor, exactly like the circumference of a well. That was too much for me. I ran out of the classroom, bumping into Principal Augusto in the hallway, who looked at me perplexed as I tried to explain, between hysterical sobs, that I needed to leave immediately. I spent the rest of that day at home, huddled under the blankets, like a frightened child, unable to logically explain what was happening. But after hours of reflection, I made a decision. I couldn't simply run away. Something in me felt that Carolina was asking for help, not trying to scare me. The next morning, determined, I arrived early at school and went directly to the center of the courtyard, that place everyone avoided. I knelt on the ground and began to remove the decorative stones that formed a circular mosaic, clearly installed there to disguise what was there before. After removing several layers, I found a concrete cover with a small carved symbol, the same symbol that Carolina had drawn several times in my notebooks when I wasn't looking. At that moment, Don Joaquin appeared, pale, and confessed, "They cemented the well, but they didn't take her out first. The family never knew the truth. They said the body was never found." With Don Joaquin's reluctant help, we managed to contact Carolina's older brother, now a man of almost 50 who still lived in the region. He cried when I told him about the manifestations and agreed to help. The authorities were involved, the concrete was broken, and the well was reopened. There at the bottom, along with dark water accumulated over decades, were the remains of who was once Carolina, still with vestiges of the blue dress I had seen in the dreams. They held a proper funeral, with the entire community present. Carolina's mother, now an elderly lady, could finally say goodbye to the daughter who, according to official lies, had never been found. After the burial, I never again felt that presence in the school. The children returned to playing all over the courtyard, including the center where a small flower garden now marks the place of the old well. I continue teaching in General Terran to this day. The school is no longer a haunted place, but I will never forget those months when I lived with Carolina. Sometimes when I'm alone in the classroom preparing materials, I feel a soft perfume of wildflowers that doesn't come from anywhere. I'm no longer afraid. I understand now that some spirits aren't trapped by evil, but by injustice. Carolina just wanted to be found, to be remembered, to have her story known. In her honor, we created a small memorial in the library, and every May 12th, we hold a celebration of life, not death. The children write letters to Carolina, telling about their dreams and hopes. Maybe it's coincidence, but since we began this tradition, our rural school, once forgotten, has received academic excellence awards and has become a reference in the region. As if Carolina, now at peace, blesses each child who passes through here, as if she had finally found her place, not in the dark bottom of a well, but in the loving memory of all of us. My name is Claudia Hernandez, I'm 28 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I led a completely different life. I worked as an architect at a medium-sized firm in Mexico City, shared a small apartment with a college friend in Polanco, and my biggest problems were the chaotic traffic and the bills that arrived each month. Everything changed with that call on a hot Tuesday in April. Aunt Dolores, with a broken voice, gave me the news I had always feared receiving. My father, Alejandro, had suffered a massive heart attack while checking the fence in the southern pasture. When they found him, it was already too late. I returned to Rancho El Naranjo on the outskirts of General Terran in Nuevo León for the funeral and what would be just a few days to sort out the paperwork. But reality imposed itself like the Sierra Madre Oriental mountains that surround our property. The ranch was in debt, the workers depended on those jobs to support their families, and I was the sole heir to a place that, despite having left behind 10 years ago when I went to college, still ran through my veins. I requested leave from work, extended my stay, and before I knew it, I had been sleeping in my old room for 3 weeks, waking up to the rooster's crow, and trying to understand the accounting books that my father kept in his small, organized handwriting. Rancho El Naranjo isn't among the largest in the region, but it has always been well maintained. It's 200 hectares of semi-arid land, typical of Nuevo León, with cattle breeding, a drought-resistant sorghum plantation, some areas with pecan trees, and an orchard that supplies not only the main house, but also the families of the 4 workers who live on the property. At the center of it all is the headquarters, a colonial-style hacienda with thick adobe walls, terracotta roof, and an internal courtyard with a stone fountain, built by my great-grandfather in the 1930s. And about 100 meters from the OE house, imposing like a silent sentinel, stands the barn. A dark wooden structure with 2 floors and an attic, large enough to store all the equipment, the harvest, and still serve as a workshop for repairs. Since childhood, I had an ambiguous relationship with that place. During the day, I loved playing among the hay bales, searching for birds' nests in the beams, and watching my father repair tractors and tools. But when the sun began to set, an uneasiness would take over me. The shadows seemed denser there, the creaking of the wood more intense, and I always invented an excuse to return home before it got completely dark. In that first week after the funeral, I avoided the barn. There was much to do in the house and offices, meetings with the bank and the lawyer. But on the morning of the 10th day, Don Manuel, the foreman who has worked with us for more than 30 years, approached me during breakfast. "Miss Claudia, we need to organize the barn. Your father left many things out of place in the last few weeks, and the rainy season is coming. Could you help me catalog the tools?" I accepted Don Manuel's proposal without much enthusiasm, but recognizing the necessity. After lunch, we walked together to the barn under the scorching Nuevo León sun. The familiar smell of hay, leather, and machine oil hit me as soon as we opened the heavy wooden doors. Beams of light entered through the cracks in the roof, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. The interior was exactly as I remembered it, but also different. Tools piled in disorderly stacks, boxes of parts scattered across the packed dirt floor, tarps carelessly covering equipment. My father had always been meticulous with his things. Seeing that disorder was like a silent confirmation that something wasn't right with him in his final days. "Don Alejandro was different in the last few weeks," commented Manuel, as if reading my thoughts. "He would come here alone at night, even after everyone had gone to bed. I found him several times sitting on that bench over there, staring at nothing." He pointed to a wooden bench leaning against the back wall. When I asked if he needed help, he said he was just listening. Manuel made the sign of the cross and muttered something I didn't understand. "Well, I'm going to look for the old records in the house, and I'll be right back. You can start separating the tools by type." I was left alone in the barn, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. I began to work, organizing screwdrivers, hammers, and pliers into separate boxes. The manual labor was comforting, giving me something concrete to do while my mind wandered between childhood memories and concerns about the ranch's future. It was when I was crouched down, picking up nails scattered across the floor, that I heard it for the first time. A whisper so low that I initially thought it was just the wind passing through the cracks in the wood, but there was no wind on that suffocating afternoon in General Tehran. I stopped, becoming completely still to listen better. Too late. It was a male voice, hoarse and distant, as if coming from within the walls themselves. She must not... I jumped up, my heart racing. Is anyone there? My voice echoed in the empty space. No response. I walked to the back of the barn, checking between the covered equipment and behind the piles of hay bales. I was completely alone. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, amplified by fatigue and grief. I returned to work, but now with an uneasiness I couldn't name. Minutes later, while organizing some tools on a high shelf, I heard it again. Claudia, beware of the attic. My name. The voice had clearly said my name. I dropped the toolbox I was holding, scattering its contents across the floor with a metallic crash. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was whispering in the barn. I left the barn almost running, tripping over the scattered tools. The afternoon sun hit me like a momentary relief, dissipating some of the cold that had settled in my bones. I took several deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I was being ridiculous, getting scared by noises in an old building. It was probably just some animal hidden among the beams, perhaps a nest of birds or mice that had made their home in the walls. But a part of me knew it wasn't that. No animal would pronounce my name that way, with that disturbing clarity. I saw Don Manuel, returning from the main house, carrying a worn leather folder. I forced a smile, not wanting to appear like a superstitious fool. I found the records, he said, but stopped when he saw my face. You're pale. Did something happen? I hesitated, but Don Manuel's genuinely concerned expression made me decide. On the truth, I heard voices inside the barn, whispers. One of them said my name. I expected to see surprise or disbelief on his face, but what I saw was something completely different. Resignation, as if he had been expecting this for a long time. Let's sit out here, he said, pointing to the shade of a nearby pecan tree. We sat on a fallen log that served as an improvised bench. Don Manuel remained silent for a long moment, passing his calloused hand over his face wrinkled by the unforgiving Nuevo León sun. Your father didn't want you to know, he finally began, his voice low. He said it was better to leave the past, buried, but now that he's gone. He looked toward the barn with an expression that mixed respect and fear. This barn was built by your grandfather, Don Ricardo, almost 60 years ago. He was a complicated man, very different from your father. He liked gambling, drinking, women. Don Manuel paused as if carefully choosing his next words. In 1965, there was a great drought in General Tehran, worse than the usual ones. The ranch was going through difficulties, like everyone in the region. But your grandfather, instead of economizing, began to gamble even more, saying he needed quick money to save the property. One night after a card game in Monterey, he lost almost everything. Money, cattle, even deeds to parts of the land. Don Manuel lowered his voice, almost whispering now. He returned drunk, furious. He locked himself in the barn. The next morning, one of the workers found him. He made the sign of the cross again. Hanged from the attic beams with a confession. Letter nailed to the wall. Your father was only 12 years old at the time. I remained silent, absorbing that revelation. I had never heard this story before. My father rarely spoke about my grandfather, and when he did, they were just vague comments about how he had worked hard to expand the ranch. No mention of gambling, betting, or a tragic end. After that, continued Don Manuel, your father became a different man, even being so young. He took on responsibilities, worked tirelessly to recover what had been lost, paid off all the debts. But he was never again the cheerful boy I knew. He looked at his wrinkled hands, and he established rules about the barn. No one worked there, alone after sunset. No one slept there, even during harvests when we needed surveillance, and the attic. The attic remained closed for years, until your father finally renovated it to store equipment, but even then he always went there accompanied. Don Manuel raised his eyes to look at me. The people of General Terran say your grandfather didn't find peace, that his shame and regret keep him tied to this place. Some of the older workers reported hearing voices, seeing tools change places during the night, feeling invisible hands touching their shoulders. Your father never confirmed or denied these rumors, he just insisted on the rules. He hesitated before continuing. In the last few months, your father began spending a lot of time in the barn, especially at night. When I asked him why, he only said, "Manuel, I think my father is trying to warn me about something I still can't understand." That night I couldn't sleep. Don Manuel's story and the whispers I heard mixed in my mind, creating disturbing scenarios. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and stood watching the barn from my bedroom window. The full moon illuminated it, creating elongated shadows that seemed to move, though I knew it was just the effect of light on the nearby trees. I made an impulsive decision. I got dressed, took a flashlight, and silently left the house. The night air was cool, typical of Nuevo León nights, even after scorching days. The only sound was the distant singing of crickets and the occasional mooing of a cow in the pasture. My heart was pounding as I approached the barn. The wooden boards creaked under my feet as I opened the door. The interior was immersed in shadows, with only occasional beams of moonlight entering through the high windows. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "I'm here," I said aloud, surprised by my own courage. "If you have something to say, I'm listening." The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the insects had stopped to listen. Then, like a collective sigh, the whispers began. They didn't come from a specific place, but from all corners at once, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Claudia, danger! He's coming!" Different voices overlapped, some clearer than others, all with a tone of urgency and fear. My flashlight began to fail, flickering irregularly until it completely shut off, leaving me in the dim light. That's when I noticed a faint light coming from the trapdoor that led to the attic, a light that shouldn't be there, a sickly greenish glow that pulsed like a dying heart. My feet seemed glued to the floor as I observed that abnormal light coming from the attic. I took a deep breath and, against all common sense, began walking toward the stairs. The whispers increased, becoming more urgent, some in Spanish, others in a language I couldn't identify. Perhaps the indigenous dialect that some of the older inhabitants of General Terran still spoke. The wood of the staircase creaked under my weight, each step a decision that questioned myself. The trapdoor was ajar, letting escape that greenish light and a strong smell of damp earth and something metallic that reminded me of the smell of dried blood. I hesitated before pushing the trapdoor completely open, but something inside me needed to see, needed to understand what had tormented my father for so many years. The attic was different from how it should be. The boxes and equipment had been reorganized, creating an empty space in the center. On the wooden floor, dark marks formed a circle, and inside it, there was a rope hanging from one of the central beams. But what made me freeze were the walls, covered with photographs. I approached trembling and recognized my father in many of them, in recent moments. In others, there was me, in Mexico City at the airport, arriving at the ranch for the funeral. Someone had been watching us. Under the photos, written with something that looked like charcoal, were phrases in Spanish. "The debt remains. Blood calls to blood." The temperature suddenly dropped. I heard a sound behind me, like dragging footsteps. When I turned, there was no one visible, but the rope in the center of the circle swayed gently, as if someone had just released it. Then, without any warning, the only lamp in the attic went out, plunging me into total darkness. In the darkness, my ears caught sounds that shouldn't be there. Heavy breathing that wasn't mine, the creaking of boards under steps I couldn't see. Something brushed my shoulder and I jerked back, hitting against the wall. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice almost unrecognizable from fear. No one answered, but I felt a presence approaching, a cold that wasn't natural, even for General Terran nights. For a brief moment, the moon appeared through one of the small attic windows, partially illuminating the space. That's when I saw not a complete figure, but a silhouette in the shadow, the shape of a man standing near the rope. I couldn't see his face, but somehow I knew he was watching me. The silhouette slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the photographs, then toward me. The whispers returned, clearer now. "Beware. He is not alone. Run." I needed no further warnings. I turned and lunged toward the trapdoor, feeling the air become heavy and cold at my back. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling on the last few steps. My ankle twisted when I reached the floor of the lower level, but the pain was barely registered by my panic-dominated brain. I dragged myself between the farm equipment, hearing the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the stairs behind me. The tools on the walls began to vibrate slightly, some falling to the floor. I managed to get up and limp to the door, pushing it with all my strength. The cool night air hit me like a blessing. "Miss Claudia!" Don Manuel was running in my direction, a flashlight in one hand and his old shotgun in the other. "I heard noises. Are you all right?" He helped me move away, his eyes fixed on the barn behind me. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Your father made me promise never to let anyone enter the barn alone at night." He knew that something was waiting. As we moved away, I looked one last time toward the barn. In the highest window of the attic, I briefly saw a face watching. An elderly man with familiar features, eyes sunken with sadness and guilt. Then the figure disappeared, leaving only darkness. 3 months have passed since that night. After the incident, Don Manuel gathered some of the oldest workers and performed a traditional ceremony in the barn, a mixture of Catholic rituals and local indigenous beliefs that, according to him, had been practiced in General Terran since before the arrival of the Spanish. I didn't ask for many details, just observed from a distance as they burned herbs, prayed, and sprinkled holy water in every corner of the building. The attic was completely emptied and closed again. The photographs, the marks on the floor, everything was removed and burned in a bonfire far from the house. I decided to stay at the ranch. I sold my apartment in Mexico City, resigned from the architecture firm, and definitively took over the management of Rancho El Naranjo. The debts my father left were less than I feared, and with some changes in management, we managed to balance the finances. I hired 2 more workers, and we started a small artisanal mezcal production with agave grown on the property, something my father always wanted to do but never had time for. The barn is still there, imposing as ever. We renovated the roof and replaced some rotten boards, but I kept the original structure. Activities in the place are normal during the day. We store equipment, store the harvest, make repairs. The paranormal activities have almost completely disappeared. Almost. Sometimes when the sun begins to set, I still hear distant whispers between the walls. Tools occasionally change places during the night. And although I have never gone up to the attic again, I know that the door I had sealed sometimes is found ajar in the morning. Don Manuel says it's just the wind, that old buildings always make strange noises. But we both know the truth. We maintain. My father's rule, no one works alone in the barn after sunset. I don't know exactly what my grandfather did, what kind of pact he sealed in that place. Perhaps I'll never know completely, but I understand now why my father returned to the barn at night before his death. It wasn't just to listen to the whispers, but to keep something contained, something that he knew one day I would have to face. 2. Some debts, as I learned, cannot be paid with money. And some family stories don't end with death. They just pass to the next generation, like a silent legacy that whispers in the walls of an old barn in General Terran. My name is Daniel. I'm 31 years old and I'm from Hermosillo. But about 5 months ago, I moved to Monterrey looking for a better job at a consulting firm. The work was tough, but I liked it, especially because I quickly became friends with Brenda and Victor, 2 co-workers who, like me, never turned down an adventure in the middle of the exhausting office routine. Brenda always said I was too serious, so to unwind and try to socialize more, I immediately agreed when she suggested a hike in the Sierra Madre on a Friday afternoon. It wasn't exactly my favorite plan, but after so many days locked inside with air conditioning, the smell of the outdoors and the promise of a panoramic view convinced me. We left work around 4:30, sun still high, sky clear of clouds, and got into Victor's car. A short engineer, always wearing a faded red cap with some holes in it. He insists are battle scars, and a fan of 90s rock playlists. Brenda started telling stories about other hikes, laughing loudly, her yellow backpack covered in pins that jingled with every step. As we were packing up in the trunk, out of nowhere, an old lady appeared. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, covered in colorful feathers, and her fingernails were painted black even though her hands were clearly worn from the Sierra sun. Without looking us in the eye, she said, "Be careful not to get lost. There's something out in those woods that likes new voices." Brenda and I exchanged that look you give when you want to pretend you don't care, but we all felt a little weird after that. I swear the air felt heavier, but I tried to forget it, thinking it was just an old story meant to spook outsiders. The start of the trail actually felt promising, with the smell of eucalyptus mixed with hot earth and the tree shadows cut out on the ground in funny shapes. Brenda led the way, turning everything into a joke, and Victor documented every stone along the path with his phone. Soon the path started to get tighter, and the yellow trail markers on the stones disappeared for a while, but nobody cared too much. We just followed the zigzag track, listening to branches snapping, birds, and that distant sound of running water. That seemed relaxing at first. For someone who grew up in the desert like me, that river sound tearing through the woods was almost magical. But then, all of a sudden, there was a strong current that nobody expected, because a fast storm must have passed over the mountain and swollen up the creek that crossed our path. We tried to cross by hopping on some stones, but the water swept away a couple of them, along with Victor's sneaker. Yep, he lost his favorite old shoe right off the bat. We laughed it off to calm our nerves, but honestly, it made us uneasy. Since the usual crossing was now impossible, Brenda suggested we go around to the right, carving a path through some wet, dense brush to try and pick up the trail further up. That was when slowly, the fun plan mood started to shift and unease crept in, just like those red ants that stung my ankle. We started walking slower, each of us lost in our own thoughts, and even the trees looked more twisted, their branches tangled high above, forming weird arches over our heads. The smell of wet earth got even stronger, and for some reason I couldn't explain, we all started speaking softly, as if any noise beyond what was allowed might wake something sleeping there. I remember seeing a stone covered in thick black moss, all warped, almost like a face laughing downward. Brenda, who was usually brave, kept glancing back, and when I asked, she just said, "Just as a precaution." But you could see the tension in her shoulders. I tried to start a conversation to lighten the mood, but then Victor's phone beeped loudly and then died for good. No signal, no 4G, just that black screen reflecting our tired faces. I pulled out my own phone and nothing, not even that E that sometimes shows up in emergencies. That was when I realized how attached we are to the idea of always being connected, and how when that fails, it leaves you feeling helpless in a way that's hard to explain. Brenda held onto the compass she had hanging from her backpack, but the needle shook strangely every time she turned east. The wind got drier, whistling through the leaves in a way that almost sounded like a voice. I wanted to laugh at my own paranoia, but it was impossible not to feel a shiver down my spine. The sun went down fast, the way it only does in the mountains, and the light started squeezing through the high branches, as if they were closing up the night just for us. The trail we tried to follow was faded, tall brush on one side, loose stones on the other, and no matter how hard we tried to find the main trail again with the yellow tapes, it was like everything had vanished. Every 30 steps, Brenda stopped and stared intently in some direction, as if she were hearing signs of people, but it was just the muffled sound of branches breaking and something moving in the leaves, far away and close at the same time. Victor, who had been joking, started walking faster, almost tripping, and suddenly said he felt like someone was watching us. He was always making things up, but nobody dared laugh this time. That's when I noticed my heart was racing, sweat running, cold down my back. Even though the night air was starting to feel heavier, a bit colder, I tried to rationalize, thinking, sure, there must be big animals, but the noise was weird. Too fast to be a raccoon, too heavy to be a bird. Everything seemed to vibrate, like the forest had woken up just to test our fear. Nobody talked anymore. We went completely silent, listening to every distant jaguar's meow, every crackling sound multiplying our anxieties. There, in the middle of that falling darkness, I started feeling something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Pure fear, a thick kind of fear, the kind logic can't calm down. By then, even our steps had changed. We each walked carefully, trying not to make noise, but the tall grass gave everything away, crunching and squeaking under our wet shoes. We still tried to joke that we just needed to get back on the trail, but deep down, no one really believed it. At every turn, the darkness felt thicker, a sticky sort of pitch black that clung to your skin and made it hard even to breathe. In the middle of all that, Brenda stopped abruptly, eyes wide, and told us to listen. In the middle of that heavy silence, a sound started to creep in, a thin, giggling laugh somehow twined up with the wind. It wasn't a child's, it wasn't an adult's. None of us could figure out where it came from or why. Victor, who'd been the most skeptical, froze. He just stood there staring behind us and muttered, "Did you hear that?" But his voice was shaky. I tried to rationalize, saying maybe it was a house or a tent somewhere lost in the woods. But man, that laugh echoed all wrong, sounded like it came from a bunch of places at once, fading and coming back. Brenda, trembling, suggested we find some place to take shelter until daylight. But in that moment, the feeling of being watched hit all of us stronger than ever. Out of nowhere, really thin branches started to fall all around us, almost as if someone was throwing them on purpose, each one making my heart skip a beat. I already felt overwhelmed, sweating, shaking, thinking maybe all those stories about people disappearing weren't just village legends after all. We crouched next to a huge stone covered in bluish-gray lichen, the kind that looks more like a painting than anything natural. Sitting there, I breathed slow, trying not to make a sound, and Brenda hugged her knees so tight her nails dug into her jeans. Victor stared off in the opposite direction from the trail, as if searching with his eyes for any sign of civilization. A pole, a light, anything. The weirdest part was that even standing still, the feeling of movement never went away. The leaves kept trembling, and around the stone I could have sworn there were fresh tracks in a strange shape, like some large animal, 3 or 4 toes, had passed by just minutes before. After a while that I lost track of, could have been minutes, could have been an hour, we heard scuffling steps out in the brush, long, heavy strides, enough to make the ground vibrate a little, like the earth itself was bothered. The sound moved from our right to our left, and sometimes there was this dry snap, like a bone breaking slowly. I got chills. I swear just then I thought about praying, even though I've never been religious. It felt like something was prowling around us, just waiting for a signal to attack, or watching us just for the pleasure of seeing us scared. Time felt warped there. My muscles ached, my throat went dry, and no matter how hard I tried to remember the guide's advice, everything seemed pointless. The sky's light faded away completely, and, in the gloom, the sounds seemed to move on their own. The sound of leaves moving mixed with short, muffled whispers coming from deep in the woods, like people talking, hoping not to be heard. For 2 or 3 minutes, nobody breathed right. Then, all of a sudden, Brenda, almost out of desperate impulse, suggested we just get out of there even if we didn't know where to go, before it was impossible to see anything. She pointed out a trail that looked wider, but none of us remembered seeing it before. Even afraid to make things worse, we got up and went. The ground was different there, layered with broad leaves, a strong smell of fresh rot, and the air was so heavy it felt like I was carrying something tied to my chest. We started walking as quickly as we could, trying not to trip over roots sticking up from the dirt. The silence turned sharp, only broken by the sound of our steps, and every now and then a far-off lament, so weird that I tried to pretend it was just the wind. Everything inside me screamed to get out of that tunnel of brush. It wasn't just the fear of getting lost, it was fear of something I still can't put a name to. My thoughts were scrambled, a whirlwind of panic and hope, all mixed together as we kept walking that improbable trail. Brenda's keychain flashlight was our only thread of light, just barely lighting up her palm and little else. At some point, we heard the sound of running water, but this time it was much louder, as if the creek had turned into a real river. My heart sped up, but at least it was a sign of life, so we followed the sound, praying we'd find any trace of the original trail. My sneakers were soaked, my legs aching, but something in my head just screamed, "Keep going." Getting closer to the river, we saw a tiny clearing. There, almost planted in the ground, was an old wooden post, kind of rotten, with a crooked, rusted sign pointing the way to the parking lot. The relief hit immediately, and so strong I almost cried for real. Brenda dropped down and started laughing, a nervous, desperate laugh, while Victor just closed his eyes and whispered thanks in Spanish. The silence of the forest seemed to loosen its grip for a moment. Only then I noticed. My white shirt had mud stains where it shouldn't have, as if someone had grabbed my arm, leaving prints of long fingers, much bigger than mine. I looked at the other two, but I didn't say anything right then. After a few minutes catching our breath in the clearing, we realized the fear still clung to our skin, like cold sweat that never dries. Time in the woods seemed to have lasted. For days, but only a few hours had passed since we'd lost track. We all knew, without a single word, there was something wrong about that part of the Sierra Madre, more than just the danger of getting lost. We walked in silence until we finally spotted the dim lights of the parking lot in the distance, where a few cars still lingered, and the presence of the city felt like a safe harbor. Before getting in the car, Brenda turned to the forest and whispered, something in a serious tone, maybe a thank you, maybe wishing for us never to return there. Victor, pale, still kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected to see someone, or something, following us. Me, I kept the memory of those finger marks on my shirt as a secret. I didn't tell anyone, not even after I finally got home and slept, only to wake up with the same strange weight on my chest. Since that afternoon, I haven't looked at the mountains the same way. I can't believe I'm building up the courage to post this here, but after what happened to me last month, I still feel this heavy something every time I see similar stories around here. My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old. I've been working for about 4 years as a rideshare driver in the metro area, and always took more night shifts because the money was worth it, and honestly, I thought the real danger was robbery or a bad-intentioned passenger. I live alone in a small apartment, peaceful life, just me, my cat Pudim, and the car that's kind of an extension of my home, radio always on, a water bottle and a blanket in the back seat for breaks. Back then I was tired, going through some tough financial struggles, the kind of phase that makes you accept any ride, no matter where. The night it happened was from Tuesday to Wednesday, already long past the weekend rush, light drizzle running. Down the windows, city almost like a ghost town. I'd done almost 30 rides and was ready to call it quits when a long ride popped up to the industrial zone, those areas where only truck drivers, security guards, and, I don't know, people wanting to disappear from the map go. I kept thinking at least I was going to close out the month with that extra, and went along with that nervous chill I get every time I take a ride to deserted places at night. After the drop-off, coming back, I remember feeling a strange relief at finally making it back to the main road. But that relief didn't last, because as soon as I crossed the old bridge over the river, there she was, standing on the shoulder, a girl completely out of context. You know that kind of presence. That seems more drawn than alive. I froze up instantly. At first glance, I thought she was someone whose car had broken down or who'd missed her ride, but when the headlights hit her, I was already uncomfortable. She was wearing a white dress, almost see-through from the rain, clinging to her body, and her hair was really dark, looked like wet black falling halfway down her back. Her skin was so pale it reflected the light, and she had a strange way of just standing there, holding a crumpled pharmacy bag, like she'd been waiting there for hours, without blinking. I hesitated, my head screaming not to stop, but my fingers were already slowing down, window only half closed. When I got close, she walked quickly to the passenger side. I checked the rear view, nobody nearby, and she said in a calm, hoarse, almost childlike tone, "Ma'am, please, I need to get to San Miguel Clinic. It's nearby. Can you help me?" If it had been a few months earlier, I would have come up with an excuse, but her expression got me in a strange way. A mix of desperation and resignation, impossible to refuse. She got in, kind of curling up, dropped the little bag on her lap, and just stared straight ahead. Didn't make small talk, didn't ask anything about the road or the weather. The car, which always smelled like disinfectant, was suddenly filled with a strong, sweet scent I couldn't identify. I felt uncomfortable but tried to stay polite. I asked twice if she wanted to notify a family member, if she was feeling sick, and got nothing. She only answered, "It's urgent," and asked me to turn up the air conditioning, even though she was shaking. I went slowly, glancing at her in the mirror every minute, feeling my chest tighten. The way to that clinic wasn't complicated. I'd dropped people off there before, just never at that hour, and never with that heavy atmosphere. I passed slowly by the intersection. Yellow light flashing and no cars on the street, just the sound of my tires on the puddles and that sweet scent now making my stomach turn. I noticed that now and then she furrowed her brow and moved her lips as if whispering to her own hands, rubbing her fingers together, a repetitive, almost hypnotic gesture. During those minutes, I kept looking for any detail that could explain my discomfort, whether it was the way she dressed, some bruise or mark, anything. But it seemed like the dashboard light never really reached her face. I swear, it was like the shadow always ran to cover her gaze, whatever the angle. About 2 blocks from the clinic, she asked to get out earlier, in front of an old gas station, one of those really run-down ones, with the sign flickering and the convenience store already closed. When I stopped, she turned to me quickly, like waking up from a trance, and thanked me with a "God bless you" so sincere I felt embarrassed. I tried to ask if she needed to wait for someone or if I could take her to the clinic's door, but she just shook her head slowly, grabbed her little bag and stepped onto the sidewalk. It took me about 10 seconds to catch my breath again, and when I finally checked the mirror, I couldn't see her walking toward the gas station, not in any direction. It seemed like she had just vanished into the fog. I stayed there for a few more minutes in the car, torn between wanting to get out of there fast and taking one last look around to make sure I hadn't imagined it all. You know that feeling that something is wrong, but you just can't explain what it is? That was exactly it. The radio, which before was just static, suddenly made a loud pop and played an old song, one of those my mum used to listen to when I was a child, and that just made things even weirder. I decided to leave quickly, trying to convince myself that the girl was just desperate, ashamed, I don't know. Anything but what my imagination kept suggesting in the back of my mind. Got home with my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I left my phone charging and stood for a while in the living room. After my heart slowed down a bit, I couldn't resist and searched the clinic's name on Google, and then searched exactly as she said, Ana Paula São Miguel Emergency. But nothing showed up. No emergency notice, no recent report, nothing linking that girl to any hospital arrival. I checked WhatsApp groups from the area and even the City Hall's Facebook, but the night just seemed to get weirder and weirder. The next morning, I almost called the police, but gave up. Who would? Believe me? At most they'd laugh, say it was just a lonely driver's paranoia at night. Things only got heavier when, in the app drivers group, an audio started going around from another colleague, Carlinhos. He reported with a trembling voice that he had picked up a girl very similar, almost at the same spot as me at the edge of the bridge, and she had also asked to go to São Miguel Clinic. But in his case, as soon as she got out, his phone froze, lost all battery out of nowhere, and only came back when he was already far from there. His face on the video call group was terrifying. He looked like someone who'd seen a real ghost, unable to hide it. And as the chat went on, more people started telling stories. A policewoman who patrolled near the gas station, a delivery biker, everyone describing a young woman in a white dress, straight hair, always vanishing near that same gas station. It took me a few weeks to go back to driving that stretch. But people who depend on the car don't get much choice, and one especially rainy night, I ended up taking a ride exactly in that direction. I was tense from the moment I got close to the bridge. The silence in the passenger seat heavier than usual. I took a deep breath, squeezed a tiny rosary my grandmother gave me years ago, and when I passed by the shoulder, I noticed a white blur out of the corner of my eye in the mirror. But this time I didn't stop. I kept going straight, hands steady on the wheel, trying not to look back, not to think too much about the possibility of someone calling out again. When I finally dropped off the passenger and got home, I felt a different sort of relief, Since then, I never again accepted spontaneous rides in that area and never let anyone in without confirmed sign-up through the app. I still can't explain what really happened that night, if it was a spirit asking for help, the echo of some old accident. All I know is that since that event, I've never felt the same comfort driving late at night. My name is Gabriel, I'm 22, and I was born and raised in Monterey. I'm a communication major at UANL, and to be honest, I never really believed in those ghost stories people in my neighborhood love to tell. I used to be one of those skeptical guys who laughs when someone talks about hauntings, but who still gets a chill in his stomach when passing a deserted old house at night. In 2022, college was eating up all of my time, and I really needed a reason to break the monotony. My best friend, Raphael, everyone calls him Rafa, skinny, a little clumsy, and always with some wild theories about sound, had the brilliant idea that we should record strange sounds from Monterey for an investigative podcast, kind of journalistic, and partly just to see how far our courage could go. I was never exactly fearless, but I don't usually turn down a challenge either. So on a Tuesday that felt just like any other, we decided to go into one of those abandoned houses in Colonia Independencia to try to catch noises and maybe chase a different story to use in our pilot episode. I remember it perfectly. It was late afternoon and the heat was brutal, the kind that makes you sweat just for existing. When we arrived, the street felt forgotten by the rest of the city. Some kids playing soccer on the corner, an old woman watching everything from her window, and right in the middle, that crumbling house with a gate tied shut by rusty wire. Rafa flashed a nervous grin and, with his recorder and a flashlight that flickered more than illuminated, we went in. I swear that at that moment I felt something change in the air, but I tried to ignore it and keep things light. Inside, time felt suspended, you know? It felt like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for us to make enough noise to wake up whatever was there. The floor was cracked tile, with old stains and a weird smell, a mix of faded paint and mildew, hard to describe. There were broken pieces of furniture stacked against peeling walls, tattered curtains clinging to windows that didn't close right. Rafa, always enthusiastic, quickly turned on the recorder and started cracking jokes to break the tension. But I could tell his hands were shaky. He has this habit of messing with his hair when he's nervous. I took in everything, trying to memorize every detail, because who knows when we'd have the courage to walk in there again. As we passed from room to room, shining a flashlight across the floor and whispering not to mess up the audio, I started noticing some weird little things. In the old hallway there were crooked frames on the wall, all with faded photographs, faces blurred by time, that seemed to be watching us. At one point, I heard something creak overhead, like something walking around up there. Rafa laughed, saying it was probably rats and that it would make a perfect background for the podcast. I tried to laugh too, but honestly I felt that uneasiness growing, that dumb doubt about whether we were really alone in there. We kept exploring, slower every time, while the recorder picked up everything. Our dumb jokes, the floor creaks, even the muffled sound of cars outside. The air just kept getting heavier. The weirdest part was when we got to the last room, sort of an office that still had a desk against the wall and a bookshelf full of old books, all with spines chewed up by bugs. There was a rocking chair in the corner, the kind you only see at your grandma's, but this one was moving gently all on its own, with a wind you couldn't even feel. Rafa and I exchanged a quick look, the kind that says everything without a word, and tried to act normal. He set the recorder right in the center of the table and said something about capturing the room's resonance, some technical thing I didn't even pay attention to because I couldn't take my eyes off the rocking chair. We stood in silence for a few seconds, both listening to our own breathing. The silence in that house was uncomfortable. It felt like someone was waiting for us to finish so they could speak. We decided to do a sort of mini interview right there, just to make sure we had some content. Rafa started asking me what I felt right then, as if it was some scientific experiment. I'd barely answered when we heard a loud thump out in the hallway, like something had fallen or been thrown, I'm not sure. No bravery at all. Rafa and I nearly stumbled over each other trying to see what it was, but there was nothing there, just a dusty old rug throwing up clouds. We froze for a few seconds, then pretended nothing happened and recorded a few minutes more. The real scare only came later, much later, when we decided to listen back to what got recorded. We got home at night, still tense and laughing nervously, because you try not to believe but the stories get into your head. At home, since we were still together, we went right to the audio to see if anything cool had come out. Rafa plugged the recorder into his laptop, put on his headphones, the classic ones patched together with electrical tape, and I grabbed a big cup of soda to relax. We started out listening to our chatter, the sounds of the street, the kids playing soccer on the corner. Everything was fine until we got to the house part, and specifically to that office room when we left the recorder on the table. Right, there the mood completely changed. You could clearly hear on the recording the rocking chair squeaking, our whispers, and a deep silence right after. But then a few seconds later, there was a whisper, way too low, almost impossible to notice. At first, Rafa paused, rewound, and cranked the volume up. That's when we heard it. A voice right up close to the mic, whispering a name that wasn't either of ours and saying a phrase that chilled my soul. "They know what you did, Hector." We didn't know any Hector, and that name echoed, in the room mixing with static, like someone trying to speak but failing. I didn't know what to think. I looked at Rafa, expecting him to crack a joke, but his face was white, eyes wide open. I'd never seen him like that. The first reaction was denial. It must have been someone outside, or that's interference for sure. But the weird thing was that before and after that part, there was no other outside noise, nothing. That could explain such a clear whisper, like someone had come right up to the recorder just to say that. The silence afterward felt even heavier, almost intentional. I tried to convince myself it was a prank by Rafa, but he was looking at me way too seriously, with a real fear on his face, something I'd never seen. We sat there in total silence. For a few minutes, just listening to the fan spinning and that voice repeating in our heads. We decided to Google the phrase, more as an impulse than expecting to find anything. And to our surprise, we found out there really had been a Hector in the neighborhood, someone involved in a crime that shook everybody back in the 80s, a poorly explained murder, the kind that turns into urban legend. The feeling that the house had somehow remembered or kept, that memory was just too creepy for me. Rafa wanted to post the audio on a forum the locals use, kind of like a Mexican Reddit, to see if anyone remembered the case or recognized the voice. I hesitated, but ended up going along, maybe out of morbid curiosity, wanting to see what came of it. As soon as Rafa posted the clip, chaos broke loose. In less than an hour, there were a bunch of comments, and everyone had their own theory. Some swore it was just interference. Others said it might be a lost old recording, but a few people knew the name right away and started recalling details from the crime, making it all creepier. One of the old guys from the neighborhood, who we only knew by sight, showed up in the comments saying that back then Hector's case got famous because they never really figured out what happened. Just rumors and loads of awkward silence. That just made it all even more surreal, and I started getting this weird goosebumps every time I listened to that audio again, like there was some hidden layer that we never should have uncovered. While the debate grew on the forum, some people started suggesting that it was all a setup, a trick to promote our podcast. I really wish it was. But the reactions from the older residents made me doubt. It truly seemed like their fear was real. A woman said she'd seen shadows inside that house. Another neighbor said he used to hear muffled screams coming from there late at night. The worst was when people started suspecting that the whispered phrase wasn't new. One user claimed that years ago he'd heard something eerily similar on an old radio, but no one ever figured out where it came from. The feeling was that, without meaning to, we'd stirred something better left sleeping. And honestly, that night I was actually afraid to hear any strange noise at home, hoping it would all stay as just audio lost on the internet. After that day, my mind wouldn't shut off. I replayed that bit 1,000 times, trying to catch any detail, a hint it was a setup, a technical glitch, anything that would get the weight off my chest. There were times when I almost thought, I heard another name, or a cry for help beneath the whisper, but maybe that was just my mind playing tricks. Rafa, always the restless one, started digging deeper, looking up old news at the university library, even messaging a former history professor. He found out that the house where we recorded was searched by the police during the crime, but officially, there's nothing about any recording, no radio, nothing like that. That phrase just appeared between walls and microphones, like a ghostly echo from the past. For a few days, we avoided the subject. The podcast came to a halt, spirits dropping, as if the city itself had swallowed up our urge to go on. But of course, curiosity always calls louder. Some people started asking us to try recording in the house again, to see if we could get anything else. Honestly, even the thought made me cold. It didn't feel fun or like a challenge anymore. It felt dangerous in a different way, like poking at a wound that never healed. I took a while to answer, but Rafa swore he'd never go back. And I decided, at least for now, I wouldn't insist either. To be honest, sometimes fear is good. It keeps you from crossing certain lines, even when everything tempts you to dig deeper. And I knew that house didn't want more visitors. In the end, we decided just to release one episode telling our experience, giving context to Hector's case, the recording, the neighborhood's reactions, and leaving the questions open. The audio went live, but we edited it all to protect our identities. No precise location, no full names. The impact was huge. More questions than answers, but oddly, no technical explanation managed to make sense of that whisper. Gradually, life got back to normal, but every now and then I still feel those chills when I remember that heavy silence in the room and the voice way too close to the microphone, as if someone was finally trying to be heard after all that time. To this day, no one knows if it was just a coincidence, interference, or if we really uncovered a forgotten memory of the city.